Let's face head-on one of the most uncomfortable and most common questions among believers and non-believers. If God is so good, why does he allow suffering? Honestly, this question has already made many people lose sleep and lose their faith. And do you know what's worse? Many people pretend they don't care about it, but deep down they're screaming inside. That's why today we're not going to gloss over it. We're going to tear away the veil of doubt, face this dilemma head-on, and most importantly, find biblical answers that make sense in real life. The truth is that not all suffering comes with an immediate explanation. But that doesn't mean God is sitting on his hands. Quite the opposite. What you'll discover here may challenge everything you've ever heard, that pain is punishment, that suffering is a sign of abandonment, or that true faith doesn't cry. Spoiler, all of these ideas are wrong. There is a purpose. And what's more, there is a promise that goes through every tear. If you have ever felt wronged, broken, or even angry with God, take a deep breath. You are not alone. And this video is not just to bring relief, it is to bring vision. Vision of the future, of purpose and of redemption. We will talk in depth, but in a way that you can truly understand and apply. There are no ready-made answers here, but there is clear direction. In 5 biblical points, you will see suffering with different eyes. And who knows, rediscover that spark of hope that seemed extinguished. And before you say that, you already know how this conversation ends. Prepare to be surprised. The problem of evil is the kind of question that echoes silently in the most difficult moments of life. If God is so good, why is this happening to me? It is an old dilemma, but as current as the morning news. This is where faith and reason meet at a complex crossroads. Many people look at suffering and conclude that God is absent, when in fact it may be the opposite. Divine justice is not always immediately understood, and this already tells us a lot. After all, understanding the existence of evil requires more than logic. It requires a spiritual journey, and it is not just any journey. It is a journey that passes through deserts, but that also finds springs. Christian theology invites us to see beyond the surface. It is not about denying pain, much less about softening tragedy, but about understanding the larger picture. Suffering, however cruel it may seem, does not escape the sovereignty of God. And here comes a delicate point. If he is sovereign, why does he not prevent evil? This tension between divine control and human chaos is where many stumble. But the answer lies in part in free will. God gave us the ability to choose, and with that came the risk of choosing poorly. The fall, narrated in Genesis, is precisely this milestone of rupture, where sin entered the scene and messed up everything. That was perfect. Many people expect God to be like a crisis manager, ready to eliminate any difficulty at the first sign of trouble. But what if the logic of heaven is different from the logic of earth? Perhaps what we see as abandonment is actually a trial with a purpose. God is not indifferent to suffering. On the contrary, he became flesh and suffered firsthand. And that changes everything. Christians are called to look at suffering with a different perspective, that of redemption, a perspective that sees opportunity where the world only sees loss. And between us, it takes spiritual maturity to make this move. There is a story of a boy who lost everything in a fire, except the Bible he inherited from his grandfather. It was there, amid the ashes, that he found hope. Not because the problems disappeared, but because his perspective changed. Sometimes pain reveals where our true foundation lies, and that is why, when dealing with the problem of evil, faith is not an escape from reality, but a deeper way of facing it. If you want to explore this further, I recommend the book Suffering is Never in Vain by Elisabeth Elliot. It is a punch of reality with equal measure of divine comfort. Now stop and think. What if this suffering that bothers us so much is in fact an invitation to something greater? Because understanding the origin of suffering is only the beginning. The next question is, why does it continue? And that is where we get into an even more personal question: human nature and the history behind pain. When the Bible talks about the fall, it is not just describing a tragic moment in the past. It is explaining a pattern that repeats itself to this day, every day. Adam and Eve's disobedience in Eden was not just an isolated mistake, it was a cosmic rupture, a breach of trust between human beings and God that opened the door to sin, suffering, and everything wrong that we know in the world. It is as if creation had been cracked from the inside, and the crack reached us. Ever since then, we have struggled with our own nature, that stubborn inclination to do what is wrong, even when we know what is right. This fallen nature explains why the world is the way it is. We cannot place all the blame on circumstances or the system. The truth is that the human heart is also broken. Who has never had thoughts that they would rather hide, or actions that later led to regret? This is a reflection of the fall. The power. Good news is that it does not define us forever. Human beings, even stained by sin, still carry within themselves the image of God. And it is this image that heaven seeks to restore, little by little, with patience and grace. But it is a process that involves confrontation, and not just consolation. You know that feeling of guilt that appears out of nowhere, or that inner voice telling you that you could have acted better? It could be more than just your conscience. It could be God calling you back. The moral pain we feel reveals a search for divine justice within us, and this is where theology meets psychology. Human beings know that something is wrong with the world and with themselves. That's why, no, one needs to teach a child to lie, but they do need to teach them to tell the truth. Human nature is out of alignment, and this affects everything: relationships, choices, even our view of God. A clear example of this is when people who live without spiritual reference seek to fill the void with achievements, pleasures, or control. Have you noticed how this never completely satisfies, as if there were a hole that nothing in this world can fill? Blaise Pascal called this a God-shaped vacuum. And he was right. The fall separated us from the source, and everything we have experienced since then is a reflection of this disconnection. The path back begins when we recognize this condition and accept that we need redemption. And this is the beginning of a transformative journey. But recognizing the problem is not enough. We must cross the valley. The Christian life does not promise shortcuts, but it offers direction. And part of this direction involves understanding the reason for suffering, not only as a consequence of the fall, but as a divine tool. After all, if God allows pain, does it also have a hidden purpose? It's funny how life seems to put us to the test just when we think we have everything under control, right? Well, it is. Suffering, although no one asks for it, often comes as a severe teacher, but one that teaches lessons that last a lifetime. From a biblical point of view, it is not a random punishment, but a refined instrument of God. Just as gold needs to pass through fire to be purified, Christians also go through pain to be molded, strengthened, and aligned with God's will. Trials, therefore, are not evidence of God's absence. They are a sign of His careful work. John MacArthur says that suffering is the training ground for faith, and that makes sense. Consider the case of someone who lost their job, for example. Instead of despairing, they choose to trust that God is in control, that there is a greater purpose. This decision of faith, made in adversity, has eternal weight. It strengthens the soul, strengthens confidence, and over time reveals fruits that would not be born in calm times. Redemption is an ongoing process, and each stage of suffering can be a part of this process. Of course, we are not saying to smile falsely in the face of pain, but to learn to see beyond it. And do you know what is most interesting? The greatest stories of hope usually come from the depths of the pit. People who today teach, help, and lead have gone through difficult deserts. It is no coincidence. Those who have cried in the early hours of the morning usually learn to value the sunrise more. Suffering, in this sense, acts as a mirror and a catalyst. It reveals who we really are and also who we can become. It is a kind of divine scalpel, painful but necessary, that removes what is superficial to reveal what is eternal. To apply this in your daily life, here is a practical tip. Record your struggles and victories in a spiritual journal. Write down how you feel, what God is teaching you, and which biblical passages sustain you. I especially recommend reading Psalm 119 during times of trial. In it, David acknowledges that it was good that he had been afflicted, because it brought him back to God's word. If it's hard to get started, start small. Write down 3 things you're grateful for, even in the midst of pain. Gratitude is a powerful antidote to hopelessness. And then, after acknowledging that pain can purify, an even more challenging question arises. If God is in control, why doesn't he simply stop the pain from happening? Well, perhaps the answer lies in the complex dance between God's sovereignty and human free will. Here is one of those theological tensions that make even the most experienced scholars scratch their heads. If God is sovereign, that is, he has absolute control over everything, how is it that we have free will? The answer may seem confusing at first glance, but it is rich in meaning. God, in his sovereignty, chose to give us freedom, and it is not just any freedom, it is the ability to choose, to love, to obey, or not. This choice is essential for a relationship with God to be true. After all, forced love is not love, it is control. And God's purpose was never to manipulate puppets, but to walk with children who choose to be with him. This means that much of the world's pain does not come because God wanted it, but because people wanted it. Wrong choices, selfish motivations, omissions, all of these generate real consequences. And here comes a delicate point. Divine justice allows these consequences to exist, precisely because free will is real. Think of a father who sees his son choose a dangerous path. He could force you to return, but he understands that without experience, there will be no genuine transformation. It is the same with God. He sees beyond the moment and works even in chaos, often without us realizing it. But wait a minute. The fact that God gives us freedom does not mean that he has lost control. Quite the opposite. His sovereignty is so absolute that he can include our decisions within his greater plan. Joseph, sold by his own brothers, is a great example of this. The evil they did to him became an instrument of salvation for an entire nation. In other words, even when sin tries to get in the way, God writes redemption with the letters of our suffering. He does not waste any tears, any mistakes, any trials. He is an expert in transforming human failures into bridges of hope. 2. Experience this in practice. It is important to learn to discern between choices that please God and those that feed our flesh. A tip? Start with Proverbs, a book full of practical wisdom for everyday decisions. Another, pray before acting. It may seem simple, but prayer aligns our hearts with heaven. Free will is a powerful gift, but it demands responsibility. And when we use that freedom to seek God's will, we find a peace that the world simply cannot offer. Now, if God respects our freedom and yet directs everything perfectly, perhaps the existence of evil has a deeper role than we imagine. Would we even be able to recognize good without it? Here's an interesting provocation. Would we really be able to recognize good if we had never experienced evil? At first glance, this question may seem uncomfortable, even a little cruel. But it carries a profound philosophical value, Many thinkers argue that suffering and evil, paradoxically, help us identify and value what is good, pure, and just. It's like the contrast between light and darkness. One reveals the other. Divine justice would not be admirable if there were no injustice for it to stand out. Without pain, we would not perceive relief. Without injustice, justice would be invisible. Imagine a world where everything was perfect all the time. No tears, no losses, no risks. Sounds like paradise, right? But would we understand the value of gratitude, the strength of faith, the power of redemption? It is precisely the contrast with pain that highlights the beauty of healing. It is in the darkness that the light becomes visible. And what's more, it is in weakness that many discover their true strength, or rather, the strength of God acting through them. This perspective is not an invitation to spiritual masochism, but rather to the profound understanding that even evil can be redirected to an eternal purpose. The stories of people who emerged from tragedies transformed are powerful evidence of this. A former drug addict who now helps others overcome their addiction. A mother who lost her son but welcomes grieving families with real comfort. A prisoner who found hope in the midst of abandonment. These testimonies point to a truth. God can use even what the enemy tried to destroy as a tool for edification. And this is one of the most beautiful features of the Christian faith. It is not denying pain, but allowing it to transform into something redemptive. If you want to deepen your understanding of this, I recommend reading The Problem of Pain by C.S. Lewis. He is one of the greatest Christian intellectuals of the 20th century, and he deals with this subject with sensitivity and depth. Another practical step: when faced with something bad, ask yourself, what can this teach me? Or how can I use this to help someone? The answer may not come immediately, but this attitude opens space for pain to become the seed of purpose. And over time, the heart matures and learns to see with the eyes of eternity. So if evil can serve as a backdrop for good to shine, perhaps the strongest examples of this are found in the Scriptures. Stories of pain that became paths to salvation. And that's where we find characters like Job and Joseph. Let's agree on one thing: there's nothing like a good story to help us better understand a profound principle. And the Bible is full of them, especially when the subject is suffering with a purpose. Let's start with Job, the man who lost everything: children, possessions, health, and even the support of his wife. But even in the midst of his pain, Job did not curse God. He questioned, yes, and a lot, but he kept the thread of faith burning. And what seemed like punishment was, in fact, a great trial with redemptive purposes. In the end, he was not only restored, but he knew God in a way he had never experienced before. That is redemption. Another incredible example is that of Joseph. Betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, unjustly accused and imprisoned for a crime he did not commit. The list of sufferings is long. But the end, he became governor of Egypt and saved not only his brothers, but thousands of people from famine. When Joseph looks back, he says, "You intended to harm me, but God meant it for good." This is the sovereignty of God in action, using even human evil as a piece of a larger puzzle. This teaches us to never measure God's hand by the present moment, because He is still writing the end of the story. And the most interesting thing about these examples is that none of them were spared pain because they were good. This dispels the idea that following God means having an easy life. In fact, many times it is just the opposite. But it is also a certainty that suffering is not in vain. Divine justice does not fail, even when it seems delayed. The mature believer understands that if he is going through a valley, it is because something great is being prepared up ahead. And this changes the way we face struggles, with less despair and more hope. Want to apply this to your life? Start by diving into these stories. Read the book of Job with a notebook by your side, writing down your doubts and revelations. Read Genesis from chapter 37 onwards and notice how Joseph maintains his character even when everything goes wrong. Then reflect, how have you reacted to your trials? Have you learned something from them or just complained? You can even write your own Joseph story, recording difficult moments that later became blessings. This will strengthen your faith and help you see God's hand even on cloudy days. These examples are not in the scriptures for nothing. They are compasses for those who are still in the midst of the storm, because the Christian life does not exempt us from pain, but it guarantees us purpose in the midst of it. And this leads us to an even more personal question. What is suffering producing in me today? Living with Christ is not a winning ticket to a pain-free existence. Quite the opposite. In the Christian journey, suffering is not seen as an accident, but as an integral part of the journey. It is as if God were saying, I will not spare you from the struggle, but I will strengthen you in it. This changes everything. Pain then stops being just a burden and becomes a tool that perfects, that transforms, that aligns our character with that of Christ. And when we understand this, we are able to take a deep breath in the midst of the trial and say, Lord, make me grow through this. The Apostle Paul is one of the greatest examples of this perspective. He faced prisons, shipwrecks, persecutions, illnesses, and yet he said, I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that will be revealed in us. This is not a denial of reality. It is a higher vision of reality. When the Christian understands that suffering has a spiritual function, he refuses to be victimized by it. Instead, he surrenders to a process of transformation. It is like entering a spiritual gym. It hurts, but it strengthens. But be careful. This does not mean that all suffering is necessarily beautiful. There is cruel, unjust, and inexplicable pain. The gospel does not romanticize tragedy, but it does not bow down to it either. It faces it head-on, with tears in its eyes and hope in its heart. Suffering reveals our limits, yes, but it also reveals the strength that comes from God. With each battle won, the Christian becomes more like Christ, who also suffered. And this is a glorious mystery. God uses pain to mold us into the image of His Son. Want something practical? When you're going through a difficult time, don't run away from fellowship. Don't isolate yourself. Join a small group. Open your heart to someone who is mature in the faith. Read Romans 5 and reflect on how tribulation produces perseverance, experience, and hope. Write down your lessons. Pray with intention. Cultivate gratitude. Yes, even when you don't feel like it. Gratitude in suffering is like putting oil in the gears of the soul. And this generates growth, because redemption begins in the spirit before it manifests itself in circumstances. And if suffering is part of the journey, the story still doesn't end there. There is something greater, promised and guaranteed by God, something that lights our eyes even in the darkest nights. Because in the end, there is a hope that never fails, and a future without tears awaiting us. The greatest certainty a Christian can have is that suffering does not have the final word, and let's face it, this completely changes the game. No matter how much pain insists on screaming, hope whispers firmly, the story is not over yet. The Christian faith does not ignore the harsh reality of the world, but points to an even greater reality, the promise of total redemption. Jesus Christ, who experienced suffering in its most brutal form, guaranteed victory over it. This is not religious talk. It is a certainty that sustains, consoles, and transforms those who believe, even on days when everything seems to be falling apart. God's promise is clear. One day, He will wipe away every tear from our eyes. There will be no more death, no more mourning, no more pain, But until that day comes, suffering continues to be the field where true faith flourishes. And this is revolutionary, because it changes the way we face our losses, frustrations, and trials. Christians walk with scars, yes, but they walk with a purpose. They understand that behind every tear there is a God who gathers, understands, and uses everything for good. This is sovereignty. This is divine justice. This is love that resists chaos. Maybe you're going through pain right now. Maybe you have wondered if God really cares. But know this. If you are breathing, it is because He is still writing your story. Do not give up. Allow this pain to bring you closer to Him and not push you away. It is in the valley that we hear the voice of the shepherd best. And it is in the darkest moments that the light of hope shines most brightly. You are not alone. And what seems to be your end today may just be the beginning of a new stage written by the hands of the Creator. Do you want some friendly advice? Keep seeking, keep trusting, immerse yourself in the Scriptures, strengthen your faith in community. Do good even when everything invites you to discouragement. Make a list of the times when God has sustained you and reread it when the difficult days come. Do not stop fighting, because in Christ, suffering is never in vain. It has an end, and that end is glorious. But maybe you're thinking, this is all beautiful, but why does God allow suffering to exist in the first place? A profound question that demands more than a short answer. So in the next step of our journey, we're going to look directly at this question with courage and faith. Maybe you're in the middle of a storm right now, emotional, spiritual, financial, or all of the above. But now you know, God is there. In the middle of it, He hasn't abandoned you. So, how about acting like someone who truly believes this? Start today. Pray more deeply. Read the stories of Job or Joseph with attentive eyes. Talk to someone about what you learned here. Transform suffering into a step of growth, because it's in practice that faith is strengthened. And tell me, which of these 5 answers spoke to you the most? Which touched a hidden wound? Share here in the comments. Let's grow together, learning from each other. And if you know someone who is suffering and needs guidance, send this video to them now. It could be the push she needed to not give up. Oh, and don't leave here without subscribing to the channel. Turn on the notification bell to continue learning, reflecting, and being strengthened by the Word. We still have a lot to discover together. Because pain is not the end. It's the beginning of something bigger.